Okay. I think just leave the PowerPoint aside. Sorry about that, but we're having too many technical difficulties. Just talk to us.
Okay, sure. All right, I can still use it for myself. So my presentation was called I'm assuming you can hear me. Let me know if you can't. The trans rights are not human rights. Arts rights here is spelled R-I-T-E-S. They are religious rituals that are undertaken for a specific purpose, and I'm going to be talking about the different purposes that the different branches of the trans religion are aiming at. And this is based on about a year of work where I have been looking at their literature. I have looked at their personal narratives, trying to piece together using skills that I learned in linguistics, trying to decipher the rule-governed system that is generating these belief statements. And so in doing so, I've come up with what I consider to be the main three branches and the main doctrinal splits between the different branches. And so as mentioned, I was recently canceled from Patreon and YouTube, and more distantly from Twitter and from TikTok for saying these heresies. If you want to see my videos, they are on Exulansic.com. And so I was asked to speak here as a detransitioner. So there is a split between detransitioner and desister. I'm kind of on the borderline there. I did undergo a medical treatment that did change my biology, and it was aimed at the purpose of achieving that concurrence, and it was while I was in the trans church, and it was because of exposure to that ideology. So I personally consider myself a detransitioner. However, it was not testosterone, it was not surgery, and it was not visible. So it's depends on what exactly you want to say the split is there. I'm definitely borderline though. I certainly took it seriously enough to go to the doctor. And in terms of, okay, whereas a desister is typically defined as somebody who underwent some sort of social transition, which would be nowadays changing your pronouns or changing your clothes or otherwise coming out in some way. And so when you're entering the church, this distinction is not that relevant. They don't really see you as leveling up in the same way. You're just as valid, and they'll give you all sorts of reasons why it's okay to not take this or that medical step. Maybe you can't afford it. Maybe you have some other condition, this or that. But once you leave, it becomes very important. It becomes a measure of your faith to determine whether you were really a member or not, because it's a religion, and religions don't like apostates. So when Christians leave Christianity, they're often told that they never really accepted Jesus, because if you really accept Jesus, then you don't leave. Okay. So in terms of my timeline, I felt what I believe would now be termed gender dysphoria when I was very young, and had a lot of difficulty with the fact that I was female and that other people could see that, and that they had expectations surrounding that related to me. I had a lot of very specific and odd fears related to that, and it was an issue that a lot of people didn't really understand, because it wasn't coming from the environment. It was coming from me and some issue I had, and but that wasn't really resolved, perhaps because my brain wasn't developed and it couldn't resolve earlier than it did. But one way or the other, by the time I got to college, I was then exposed to a lot of the current gender beliefs when they were becoming popular. And this would have been the main exposure I got was in 2009, and I was at Berkeley. Berkeley is where Judith Butler teaches. So I had a lot of exposure to her ideas. I was a gender studies major. Her ideas were very influential in the gender studies department, although it's worth noting she does not teach in that department, or at least did not when I was there. I believe she still does not. She's in the rhetoric department. She's also not a linguist, even though her argument famously relies on comparison with a concept that comes from linguistics, which she extends a bit further than I believe she should. So her idea is that gender is a performance, and so it's like a linguistic performance. In linguistics, the idea of a performance is the verb pronouncing. If I say, I now pronounce you man and wife, the only way to do that verb is to say, I pronounce you man and wife. And so it is a performative verb. That's what it means. You do it by saying it. And so she tries to extend that to social behavior. I don't think that really flies, and I wonder how much she has read about social pragmatic language. But in any event, I think that it doesn't quite make a lot of sense in retrospect, because anybody can say any word. And the idea of gender is that some people more naturally say some words. And I don't think that that makes a lot of sense. It also raises the question, you can lose your language. You can have a head injury and lose language entirely. And so at that point, you would be the linguistic equivalent of somebody who was agender, somebody who was without a gender. And so what does it mean to be agender? Because it's presented by these people as being not a severe handicap. But if gender is like language, then being agender would be a severe, severe handicap. We're talking about somebody that would need round-the-clock care, according to their idea of gender. So it's not a very coherent model. It's not rooted in a deep understanding of language. Yet they're making these comparisons. So I was also going to talk a little bit in my next slide about when I was still in college. I had the support of a therapist who was not a gender therapist, who was a neutral therapist. I also had the support of other sources of support. And so I was able to reason through a lot of things about risks, consequences, and outcomes, and exercise good judgment in the choices that I made to not continue pursuing these. A close friend was not so lucky. Her first exposure to therapy was somebody who advertised as a gender therapist that she thought out for gender therapy. And shortly after she began gender therapy, she was actually sustained a very significant head injury. And despite the head injury, she was allowed to go through the double mastectomy that she didn't need a couple months later. And as somebody in the field I'm in now, a big part of my work has been working with brain injury rehabilitation. And it disturbs me more and more that everybody in her environment, every medical person connected to her knew that she had been in this injury because it involved a hospital stay. It was a very significant injury. And she was still allowed to go through with this just a few months after starting this gender therapy too, and without hormones. So when did it start to jump the shark for me? Jump the shark is an expression that comes from Happy Days, and it refers to when I started to realize this wasn't all it was cracked up to be. As I mentioned, one was this complete failure of the gender industry to recognize that she was acutely unable to give consent to what was done to her. The second one is that there was an abandonment of principles of scientific inquiry that I saw gaining traction. And one of this was that they'd started, this individual in particular and other people had started to speak out against the practice of sex segregation in medical research. And I recognize that as a feminist, as somebody that's familiar with the history of women in medicine, to be very dangerous. So at that point, I kind of realized that we're leaving the rational side of things and entering a world where we were trying to doctor medical data in order to comport with a pre-existing belief structure that wasn't rooted in any sort of definition of evidence. And then the other thing for me was seeing more and more of people who are identifying as trans men, which for me never exceeded the scope of my sex. I was always a kind of woman as a trans man. I was never a man. I was never asking people to call me he, him, or insisting I was male in some way. That wasn't something that fit into my theoretical framework of this. But it had started to become more and more popular for lesbians to call themselves gay men, and that just bothered me. I didn't like that. So gender identity, I want to define this a little bit. The reason that I would say that this is like a soul. One is that the gender identity, which is claimed to be some sort of deep internal sense of knowing, that is a claim that it is only known to the devotee. It's only known to the adherent. The individual is communing with this deity, this gender deity, I call them, and gaining special knowledge from the deity and gaining special blessings of the deity. And the blessings are increased if other people in the person's environment also pray to the deity. And we pray to the deity by acknowledging a belief in the deity and acting as if we care what the deity thinks about what's going on in the real world. And we do so by using the deity's pronouns and pretending that the deity's pronouns supersede the individual adherent, the devotee's adherent scope. So they've pulled some fast ones on us too with the definition. It is claimed that gender and sex are distinct entities. However, which at the time made sense to me, because it's like the idea for gender was supposed to be about protecting masculine women from discrimination for the fact that we defy gender norms. That's how I thought of it. And then it has turned into protecting males from discrimination on the basis of sex. And that doesn't make any sense, because if a male is being discriminated against in a female-only space, he's not being discriminated against on the basis of his gender identity, unless gender identity is the same as sex, and gender identity is not the same as sex. The only way that a person can be discriminated against on the basis of their gender identity in a female-only space is if they are female. That's the only way. That's their logical prerequisite. And yet we're being told that discrimination on the basis of sex is the same as discrimination on the basis of gender identity, and it's not. It's not. These are female-only spaces, not feminine-only spaces. If they want to have feminine-only spaces, they can certainly lobby for that. I'm not against that. I support the aims of feminism, which is the term I've given to the rights movement for feminine people, feminism. But where it conflicts with feminism, I'm against it because I'm a feminist. And feminism is a rights movement for females, female humans, both girls and women. So let's see. So I've also named these subsects. So the main sect, probably I would argue the oldest sect, would be Trans Classic. And the big division there is Our Lady of the Perpetual Hormone Replacement Therapy. And the main doctrinal split between this one and the other main doctrine, the Church of the Nonbinaries, is that in Trans Classic, in Our Lady of the Perpetual Hormone Replacement Therapy, there is a metabolic or neurological basis for transitioning. Some people have some sort of biological reason that they need to transition, if it gets that far, which is why I call it the Our Lady Perpetual Hormone of subdivisions, because there's more undifferentiated Trans Classic that doesn't think about it too much, but also does not share the non-binary beliefs, so they would still fall under Trans Classic. But the one with the most articulated sect, the one that I was part of, is Our Lady of the Perpetual Hormone Replacement Therapy. And so they believe that there is a biological need to transition for some people. They also will believe in two genders, believe that they're connected to the two sexes, and also believe that there is the gender identity is an entity that forms by age 3 and is connected to one of the two sexes. The more recent iteration has been Church of the Nonbinaries. The big doctrine splits there, the schisms there, is that this sect believes in medical transition as a means to achieve a sense of unity, a sense of congruence with your internal sense of gender. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with biology. You're not taking the testosterone because you're somehow actually a male in some way and need the testosterone. You're taking the testosterone because you want to look male, and that will achieve a sense of internal congruence, and then you'll feel better. So that's the split. They have a different set of beliefs about why we do this practice. And those beliefs are irreconcilable, of course. The Church of the Nonbinaries also typically sees gender identities as being more independent of the individual and less tied to the individual. So they move around. Your gender can change in history class. Your gender changes from day to day. A person can even be without a gender. As I mentioned, you can be agender. And so you are, this is the one that's more likely to also argue that you don't necessarily need to have experienced this as a child. You know, this is the real driver of the rapid onset group, because this is the one where you just kind of need to let people know that this is possible and let it go from there. There doesn't need to be the whole history there. Because you can just get a gender identity, or you can get in touch with it, but it's not connected to biology, and it's not really connected to the material world in the same way, and it can change. So obviously kids need time to explore their gender, is what we keep hearing. Why do they need time to explore it if it's already forms and it forms naturally? It doesn't make a lot of sense. Do I need time to explore my language as a teenager, or do I already know what language I speak? Pretty sure I already know what language I speak. I still encourage exploring languages, of course, as a linguist. Discipleship of the disaffected, this sect believes that they are very different from you and other non-binary people, and they do not want you to make any sort of conclusions about them, what they might be like, and what they might want in the future. And so they don't really have any firm beliefs. You could also think of them as undifferentiated non-binaries. Church of the Nonbinaries versus the Our Lady Perpetual Hormone Replacement Therapy beliefs. The non-binaries believe in an unlimited number of gender identities. They believe these identities move between different individuals on different days. They believe that these individuals can be agender without a gender identity. And that's in contrast to Our Lady of the Perpetual Hormone Replacement Therapy that believes in two identities. believe that these identities form very early, believe these identities are connected to man and woman, and those are somehow connected to male and female. And this is the sect that will believe that there's some sort of neurological mapping problem, that the brain has somehow expects there to be different genitals, and that's the reason. And so they, of course, believe, therefore, that everybody has a gender identity. To my knowledge, I do like to ask them things like, what gender was Terry Chavot after the brain injury? They usually haven't thought about her because they tend to be kind of ableist and don't really think about people with unusual brains, in my experience. This sect, so then there's also, since then, has emerged a non-denominational Church of Trans, and this sect is an attempt to merge Church of Non-Binaries with Trans Classic and Our Lady of the Perpetual Hormone Replacement Therapy by ironing out the major doctrinal differences in the name of respecting each other's identities and pronouns, and thereby, solidifying their social cultural power. Major beliefs that set them apart from other trans subdivisions include pronouns don't equal gender, which is was a shock to me to read on TikTok that was now a stable belief that a lot of people have. So there's an emergence of this concept of mispronouncing as being distinct from misgendering. So you can use somebody's correct pronouns and still misgender them if they figure out that you thought of them as the wrong gender. And this would cover things such as if you use a gendered term, like if you referred to somebody who uses he, him as an actress, but their gender was male, but if their gender is female, but they use he, him, then it's not misgendering or mispronouncing. So it gets very complicated very quickly. And so these are both attempts to make up for the fact that non-binary pronouns do not comport with the binary gender categories and model of perpetual hormone replacement therapy. So in order to make up for that, they have rules about just how do we cope with the fact that this is a non-denominational church. So in terms of gender identity in law, pronoun expectations are anti-disability rights. Pronouns are a learned neurological function. I'm a pronoun therapist. I've spent years rebuilding people's pronoun systems and ability to use pronouns for them to gain some function back, some. And I don't want them to be harassed at work over stuff that doesn't have anything to do with what they're there to do when they work so hard to be able to use pronouns at least some of the time, and not correctly a lot of the time, not specific correctly anyway. They're correct enough to get the point across, and that should be good enough. So pronouns are a learned neurological function, and therefore an individual's capacity to use preferred pronouns can be affected by any disability that affects the ability to use language, attend, pay attention, speak, remember, or think. And that is a lot of disabilities. Pronoun expectations are anti-civil rights. Accent and second language discrimination is a major mechanism of discrimination on the basis of national origin, race, and creed, which are protected classes of people. Speech and cognition discrimination, meaning unreasonable discrimination that is unrelated to essential job functions, are a mechanism of discrimination against older employees who are more expensive to employers. Meaning the older an employee is, the more likely it is that the employer will have motivation to fabricate a hostile work environment claim to justify firing an older employee on the basis of not being able to perform these pronoun expectations, which are of course unverifiable, whether they were even performed correctly or not. It's not materially, objectively unverifiable. All they have to do is lie, literally all they have to do. Unless it's recorded and a linguist helps them, but even then you can't prove that the pronoun was wrong because we're appealing to personal knowingness. I can't measure your knowingness. As far as I know, your knowingness doesn't exist. Pronoun expectations are anti-religious liberty. Gender atheists, and a gender atheist is a person who does not believe that you have a gender identity, have a civil right to not be compelled to profess belief in the invisible, unverifiable, unmeasurable, improbable entities that have not been demonstrated to have any sort of material existence, which would be gods, which are said to have great power and wrath should we not worship them. And that's what they're said to have, right? If you don't worship them, they will harm the children, is the idea. Any religion with a belief in the separateness of maleness and femaleness and any prohibition on bearing false witness has the right not to use pronouns which are lies. And so I want to talk a little bit about the human cost of transition. And my research has uncovered people who have had transitions that ended up costing upwards of $1 million, where they spent months in the hospital due to multiple blood clots. I've interviewed people who ended up with recto, I won't even finish that phrase, but complications that left them unable to control their own bowels. And all these are extremely predictable, and there is no end in sight for the complications. They're not better now. So the medical industry is mutilating people who they know to be mentally ill, and they often know to also be brain injured. And they're doing so, making money hand over fist in an environment where anybody who says, "What are you doing?" is shouted down, deplatformed, and vilified. This is not a good situation. And the human cost of it is, it remains to be seen. And we have no idea. And so part of my work has also been documenting the I Am Jazz series on TLC, which has followed one of these children. And the short version is he's not doing well. He was transitioned when he was 11, immediately started having suicidality, apparently, according to the mother now. And yeah, it's you can watch my work on my website. But we have no idea the true scale of this. We have no idea the extent of it. All we know is that these individuals will be living with the long-term effects on their body and on their brain, because everything that's not developing in their body is also not developing in their brain for the rest of their lives. We are living through an age of sex lobotomy. And so one day you will be asked, did you stand up against sex lobotomy? What did you do when it was happening? And so I encourage you to think about what your answer is going to be. And finally, I want to end with the definition of Exulansic, because I get asked that a lot. It comes from Exulansis, which is from the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows by John Koenig. And it means the tendency to give up trying to talk about an experience because people are unable to relate to it, whether through envy, pity, or simple foreignness, which allows it to drift away from the rest of your life story until the memory itself feels out of place, almost mythical, wandering restlessly in a fog, no longer even looking for a place to land. We have to keep talking about what's happened to us. So it's we have to keep speaking out and not let them silence us. Because we deserve a place to land. Thank you so much for hosting me tonight.